Thanks so much. Really appreciate you having me here today. Hi, folks. I'm Ara, N6ARA. The talk here is about parks on the air and summits on the air and my journey to doing that in Japan as an American. So, a little bit about me. I'm a robotics electrical engineer by day. I've been a ham since 2007. And I actually got my ham license when I heard that they had dropped the CW requirement. I at the time I thought, well, I never want to learn Morse code. That's really hard. Turns out, spoiler alert, I actually really love CW and I ended up learning it and somehow turning it into a business as well. Um, and a lot of my interests originally began in repeaters and emergency comm when I first had my technician. And then when I went to college, I started building my own APRS tracking beacons and learning embedded systems programming and designing small little radios. And so, as you could probably tell, I tinker quite a lot at home, and build a lot of my own gear. And the hobby has just grown completely out of proportion now, and tons of test equipment at home. I'm sure, like most of you as well. And one of the key takeaway or key points here is I actually used to not like hiking, and SOTA really changed that for me. And I'm still very curious to learn more about DX. I had a lot of fun at the Pacific Northwest DX conference and learned a ton. And I've been slowly trying to get into contesting and hopefully someday uh, do a DXpedition myself. So I'm sure many of you have probably heard of all these, things on the air. So summits on the air, parks on the air. There's also islands on the air, lighthouses on the air, and my personal favorite, Walmart parking lots on the air, which only happens, I think, like once a year. But they haven't had that in at least a year or two now. But all of these really share a common goal, which is you go to a special location, you make some contacts and exchange a special exchange, typically, and then you upload your logs and you earn your awards or your points. And so in the Venn diagram of things, when it comes to SOTA, you have ham radio, and and that has an intersection with hiking, right? So it's sort of the combination of those two things. And many people are in various spots in this Venn diagram. Personally, I was in the ham radio only crowd, and I kind of gravitated towards hiking when I first learned about SOTA. I live in an apartment, and so when I wanted to get into um, HF radio, I realized I can't really put up an antenna. There's no feasible, reasonable way here, and so my buddy told me about summits on the air, that you have to go outside and go to the top of these mountaintops and you can set up your antennas and start operating. And that sounded really intriguing to me. And at the time, I realized I'd been staying indoors and not really going out and getting much exercise. This was around 2020 during the pandemic. So I was just sitting around a bunch, and I figured, this is a really good way to get some blood flow and hopefully get in a little bit of shape. So that's personally what I love about it. So, what is Summits on the Air? For those unfamiliar, it's a point-based award scheme, which is just a fancy way of saying an ongoing game that encourages folks to take their portable ham radio gear to the top of a mountain and to operate and make contacts. The official website I've listed here. I'll make these slides available after the talk, so you don't have to, jot these down. And the neat thing about it is that it's always going on. It's not a special event. Most of the time, you're going to get folks who are on summits during the daytime. Nighttime is not as common. And just some terminology, because I'm going to be talking about activators and chasers. The activators are the folks who actually climb to the top of the mountains and get within what is known as the activation zone. So it's this contour, this region close to the very, very top of a summit. And there's some rules around that. We don't have to get into it, but there is an area you have to get within to be considered on top of the summit, and then you start making your contacts. Now, the chasers are the folks outside of that activation zone, so people on the ground or at home around the world. Now, as an activator, when you get to the top of a summit, you need to make a minimum of 4 contacts, log 4 contacts on that summit to get the points associated with that summit. And the points actually vary based on these altitude bands effectively for different regions, depending on where you are. And the points range from 1 point summits all the way to 10 point summits. And as you can imagine, 10 point summits are the highest ones. And so, yeah, right. You have to make 4 contacts, and all you have to really exchange is call signs. But for the most part, folks also exchange a signal report. You log that into your logs and upload that to the website, and the website awards you points, and you can kind of track that. And there's other awards on top of it. It's not just the SOTA points you get just for activating it. So the activators get their own set of points. The chasers have their own set of points. So you could sit around all day at your home shack and just crank away at obtaining chasing points and working all the folks on top of mountains. And then there's another special set of points associated with activators making contacts with other activators. So as you can imagine, this hobby has grown quite a bit. And so folks, anytime you're activating, is a very high likelihood there's multiple people on top of mountaintops. And so if you can make a contact with them, you get a special set of summit to summit points, or S2S points. So what I thought I'd do for this talk, at least, is sort of take a screenshot of the map that's on the SOTA website that shows where all the summits are. And you can go through and you can zoom around and look around the world on, which countries have summits on the air and what summits are nearby that you could go to. Here I focused on Spokane because this is the Spokane DX Association, and took a screenshot. So all those dots you see here are various summits around you. I don't have a sense of scale of how far away some of these are, but if you go to the website, you can kind of zoom in around and see, not only where it is, but also how many times it's been activated and by the call signs of who has activated it, which can be really helpful in that, you may want to get an idea of what it was like accessing the summit. Some summits are closed off to the public. Some other summits are just really difficult to climb. So it does help to have that community to ask around and find out what it was like to traverse to the summit. So switching gears, so that's summits on the air. It's an entirely its own thing. And then there's parks on the air, which I'm sure more folks are familiar with. I think at this point, parks on the air is probably one of the most popular OTAs, if you will. So National Parks on the Air, it is also an awards program, although there is no points associated with it, like how SOTA has. But you get different awards for activating unique parks and parks during certain hours. And there's there's like way more awards than I could list here on a single slide. But it too is also always ongoing. It's not a special event. And the folks, and then again with the terminology, the activators are the folks who go to the parks, and the hunters or chasers, if you will, are the ones who contact them. Now with parks on the air, you actually have to have a minimum of 10 contacts to consider the park activated and to earn your awards for that park. So it does require more contacts than summits on the air, which does tend to make it a little bit more challenging. But at the same time, with parks, you can actually drive to these parks most of the time. And so that means you can pack heavier gear and more power and make tons of contacts that way. So it is kind of weighted in a sense, if you think about it from a game theory perspective. And with parks on the air, it's also the same thing, right? It's exchanging call signs. For the most part, you can most folks exchange signal reports and the state they are in. And so all you have to do is log that in your logs, whether it be on your phone or on a paper log, submit that onto the website, and the website awards you your awards. And the interesting thing about parks on the air is that I would argue it's predominantly single sideband and FT8 or FT4. In fact, this photo here on the right is of a little portable FT8 rig I put together with my a little Android phone running. I think it's called FTX, connected over USB to QRP Labs QMX radio. and then into a Gawant antenna with a whip, and I was able to work like all over the United States just with this little portable station. But of course, you can imagine you could bring much larger radios with you to these parks since you could just drive to them essentially. And so I took a screenshot as well of the Parks on the Air website map of the Spokane area. And I was actually kind of surprised to learn that there aren't too many parks that are available. However, one thing to note here is, unlike summits on the air where you have to get to a very particular point, be it the summit, with parks on the air, you just have to be in the boundaries of the park. And so these dots kind of just tell you roughly what parks are around, like where they are. And sometimes the dot isn't really placed very well. Like I'm guessing, this might one case might be that you have a park here that's right along the river, but it turns out the actual park itself extends across the entire river or something along those lines. So typically when you go click on these dots on the website, you have to look up what specific national park or monument it's for, and then go look at that park's website to see where it is, what the zone is for that map or for that park, so you could be within the park to activate it. So what I really like about summits on the air and parks on the air, in particular, at least this is my interpretation or my favorite thing about it, is it really comes down to optimizing your packs for volume and mass, and that's particularly true for um, uh, uh, summits on the air. So, the more weight you have to carry with you, the more painful it is to uh, uh, drag this up. If you have a big heavy pack, like a huge QRO battery and radio and all this stuff, you got 40 pounds on your back, you're going to be miserable the whole time hiking up. With parks on the air, not so much. You can kind of just drive up and you got to carry it to a bench nearby or something like that. The other great thing about it is that I use this as an opportunity to test my homebrew gear. So I love building things at home, and I equally enjoy field testing them. It is a little bit risky, right? Because you build this stuff at home, and I don't have a way of really testing things at home myself. I don't have like a front yard or anything like that. So I usually like to take things out to the field, test it out, enjoy some sunlight, and see how it does. The other thing I think that's really cool about SOTA and POTA is that most folks are very, very receptive to trying different modes and just, or bizarre bands. So if your rig is capable of doing something, there's a high likelihood that there is a chaser or hunter out there who's willing to configure their hardware to work you on that weird mode or band. And then personally, I just love building kits and planning and working through contingencies and making sure that I kit all my hardware together so that when I get to the summit or I get to the park, I'm not going to set this thing up and be like, oh crud, I forgot my SMA to BNC adapter or something like that. I really enjoy that aspect of it as well. And of course, it's great to get exercise, to go outside, you go to new places as well. I've been to so many places in Los Angeles now, that where I live. If I don't think I mentioned that part yet. I'm in Southern California. I have been to so many different summits and parks because of summits on the air and parks on the air that I probably would have never gone to in my life had it not been for these programs, and just seen tons of beautiful sights. And as well, I could tell when I first joined this meeting, you guys are all talking. There's this camaraderie and sense of community, and I believe there is also that in different pockets depending on where you are. At least for SoCal, Southern California, there's a SoCal SOTA group, and it's a lot of folks who all know each other. We also talk a lot on Slack. It's like a chat program, and yeah. So and I figured the DX community also has these sort of things as well, right? So this is actually a picture of my office here. I was building a 3-element 6-meter Yagi at home, and I was like drilling things into my carpet by accident and chopping metal and soldering things up. And nothing's quite as satisfying to me as like doing all this work, packing it into my backpack and heading out to a local park or heading out to a summit to set it up. And it's cool because it's also a challenge to see how lightweight you can make something, how portable can you make it so that you're suffering less taking this outside. And so I figured I'd throw in a couple of photos here of random things that I've built over the years, trapped end-fed half waves, loaded end-fed half waves. I have this great little QCX mini 20 meter radio with a AX1 vertical antenna by Elecraft. And obviously my favorite radio of all time, the Elecraft KX2, is a fantastic radio for SOTA and POTA. And yeah, we get to go to these beautiful places and operate radio, enjoy some sunshine. And as you can see, I've also, the hobby has spiraled out of control as I've bought more QRP radios than I can count at this point. And so, I'm really just building assets, I guess, to where I've gotten to now. But aside, if you pull away the radios and just look at what this aspect of the hobby gets you to do, is it gets you to go outside and just enjoy nature. Something that I personally didn't admire and appreciate enough until I got into this. And so, I've gone to really bizarre places and seen a lot of beautiful, beautiful sights in nature that I never would have otherwise. And I'm really very much appreciative of that. So in POTA, I think one thing to, and in SOTA as well, one thing to keep in mind is that you are the DX. And you can kind of do this every single day, like without a fail. Every time I go out and activate, I am getting tons of people calling me back anytime I call. And really, I guess due to its popularity, modest antennas tend to go a very long way, right? So from a what kind of radio should I bring with me? In general, QRP is plenty, especially if you're doing CW. And QRO is going to equal a pileup. I mean, like if people can hear you, you're going to be getting tons of folks calling you back. And it's really bizarre because the most compromised antennas tend to work. I mean, even just a few milliwatts of power making it out, specifically in CW, you're going to get people who hear you, who are going to be pointing their giant beams at you to try to work you because you're some new park for them or something along those lines. And along the way, I mean, I've been doing this now for 4 years or so. You make a lot of friends, and not only just friends locally, VHF, UHF, but around the country and in fact around the world, which sort of alluding to the Japan stuff coming up here. So I thought I'd put together just a simple example. I think a lot of you probably already all know this, but it is nice to kind of list it out and look at it. So what a typical setup for Parks on the Air looks like, right? So all you need is a radio, a battery, an antenna, and then whatever accessories you need to support all that. So if your antenna needs a tuner, like you see here, small little pocket-sized tuner for this QRP radio. Headphones, you don't necessarily need them, but I like to put them on just because it's great to pull out the weak signals with headphones. Logging, most folks I know will use apps. Nowadays, there's plenty of great apps out there that you can just punch in the call sign, signal report, and it'll automatically generate the files for you to upload. But I also know a lot of other folks who do paper logs. And then your microphone, your CW key, and then if you're doing digital modes, a laptop or even phones, which is great because you don't have to lug a whole laptop and make sure it's charged and all that. Phones nowadays, there's apps for doing FT8 and various other digital modes. So, I would encourage folks who are interested in doing Parks on the Air, Summits on the Air to figure out what gear they need. I think for the most part, if you participate in places like Field Day or events like Field Day, you may already have the gear for it. Home stations, sometimes you may just need a battery. Like really all it takes is to unplug that AC to DC converter and replace it with a battery. And I always encourage folks who don't have the sort of gear at home to reach out to their clubs and maybe just borrow some equipment and see if this is something for them. I'm when I first got into this, I actually purchased a $200 kit HF radio that was just like super cheap, really, really crappy. I'm not going to call out what radio it was, but I didn't know if I was really going to like this aspect of the hobby and if I was even going to really get back into ham radio after several years of hiatus. And it wasn't until I, started I built this kit, which I spent a ton of time on tuning in and building it, and then took it to the summit. And like, I barely worked a station in Canada with it for the first time, and it blew my mind. And like, I got bit by the bug. Like that was it. Like I was like, I want to keep doing this. And then I started buying more gear and whatnot. But I think it would have been a shame had I spent thousands of dollars to buy all this gear and then not liked it. So yeah, reaching out to clubs to get gears is I think a great idea. Um, Personally, I do a lot of CW. In fact, I think CW came out of a necessity for me, just because if you're hiking up top of mountains and you're carrying all this heavy gear, you don't want that. And so that means smaller radio, smaller power, and at some point when the power gets low enough, sideband gets way, way harder to work with. And so most folks who do summits on the air learn CW. That's how I got into it. And that's just a ton of fun. I love CW and I cannot believe uh, that I like it so much. But sideband, especially for parks on the air, is just an absolute wild ride. I mean, you could be sitting there, especially if you have a 100-watt radio, you could be sitting there all day just cranking through contact after contact. And I have friends who leave parks with like 100 new contacts, and it's not abnormal. FT8 also, as I mentioned earlier, is always an option. And I already covered a lot of this, but like, trying new modes, trying new things that your radio does, hitting up people and being like, hey, I'm going to try D star out or something along those lines. You're bound to find people around your area or somewhere in the United States who are willing to set the radios to work you. And in fact, I took here the most extreme case, which is I actually lugged up a dish and a 10 gigahertz transverter and my IC705 and made 10 gigahertz contacts with a couple people in the SoCal area who also do 10 gigahertz, usually for the 10 gigahertz and up contest by the ARRL. But in this case in particular, folks got to dust off their gear and set it up. And like, I emailed the list and tons of people came back like, oh, finally a reason to get this stuff set up. So, this is another aspect of what I love about parks on the air and summits on the air is like folks are always just willing to try to make contacts with you. So I'm going to cover spotting here real quick. If you're a hunter and you got a great station at home, you are an absolute hero to the activators. In fact, you can even use remote stations to hunt people. There's no rules against that. And if you are dialing around and you hear a POTA activator or a SOTA activator, it's a huge help to them if you spot them on the POTA website, pota.app. It's super easy to make a login. You can sign up very quickly, and then you just hit add spot. You punch in their call sign, what frequency they're on, and they will thank you to bits. Because I've definitely been stuck in a park calling CQ forever and nobody's hearing me, and suddenly I get a huge pile up out of nowhere, and it's only because one very kind person heard me and spotted me. So yeah, that's typically how it works. And if you're the activator yourself and you have cell phone reception, it's completely allowed to self spot. It's not like some contests where you're not allowed to do any sort of spotting. It's absolutely allowed and in fact encouraged. So if you go to the POTA website and you pull up the spots, this is kind of what it looks like. They'll list a bunch of these cards with people's call sign, what park they're at, what state they're in, what frequency they're on, and then it'll also list who spotted them. And there's also a comments field, like you could say, oh, their signal sucks, but they're barely making it out to California, or great signal, or they're about to go QRT, or whatever you want to type in there. And then a timestamp associated with when that was posted, so you know how fresh that spot is. This is yet another Venn diagram. Apparently, I love Venn diagrams of parks on the air and DXpeditions and DXing, since this is a DX club, to sort of highlight the differences and, quite frankly, all the really great commonalities, right? So With POTA, it's all really low cost, a little more higher frequency, easier to access, typically smaller gear, as opposed to D expeditions, which tend to cost quite a bit of money, lots of gear. You have some crazy adventures and travel, and they are more, I assume, less. They don't happen that often. And they typically operate from very rare locations, where with POTA, that's not necessarily the case. A lot of them are not very rare locations. But in common, there's careful planning and research and building good kits and thinking through backup gear and testing things and working with your community to do all the planning and adventure at the end of the day. I think we all love that part of it. So far, I've only been talking about parks in the air and summits on the air. But this talk is titled "POTA and SOTA in Japan." And so, why Japan? Where did this all even? Why are we talking about Japan to start with? And that stems from the fact that one of my very close friends actually moved to Japan 2 years ago, and he said, after the dust settles, after I moved, like, come by and visit me. And I was like, that sounds great. So my wife and I booked flights to go visit him last year, almost a year ago today. Or no, well, it's been over a year now. Oh gosh, I keep forgetting we're in March. And you know, as we were planning on what to do there, I realized, over these few years, I've actually made a couple of friends over there, just through CW contacts alone. And so I emailed these folks, and I found them on QRZ. I'm like, hey, I'm coming to Japan. Would love to meet with you and operate with you, and if you're available and whatnot. And all of them were very, very welcoming. And of course, please, let us know when you're going to be here. I'm like, great. And then I realized, I'm like, wait a second. I probably should get a license to operate there, because I can't operate as N6ARA. Um, so I remembered that, in at least when taking the test, that, like, oh, there's this concept of a reciprocal license. Like, okay, so I got to do that. What is that? And, like, went googling for it and found a an English website posted by the Japanese Amateur Radio League, so JRL, that details the process of how you do this. And it turns out, if you have an extra license, you pretty much get the equivalent of an extra license in Japan automatically. If you have a general license or a technician license, there's a couple of extra limitations that get applied, and it does get a little more complicated. But you do have to fill out some forms and submit them to the Japanese to the JRL, and then the JRL will interface with the Japanese government to get you a temporary license for 1 year. It does expire after a year unless you renew it. And so I learned all this and found out that you have to submit your paperwork 60 days prior to operating. And I was 58 days out from operating. And that was a huge bummer, because I thought this was over. It's not going to happen, but at least I'll get to go meet these people. But around that time, I told this news to one of my friends, Waka-san, JG0AWE, and he went out of his way and he essentially bypassed the Japanese Amateur Radio League and made an appointment with the government directly on my behalf, submitted all my information for me, and within the span of like 2 weeks, I got my license. And it actually arrived on Christmas too. So I got the call sign JJ0XMS, which was somehow fate, I feel like. Very, very, very fitting. And now I can't forget that call sign. But it helps to have friends in locations, but it helps even more to do your research early and learn from me making this mistake. I think I got lucky here that I got the call sign in time before my trip. Another important thing to realize is that when you're in these other countries, they have different band plans, right? And different frequency start-stop frequencies. For example, the 2 meter band here in the US ends at 148 megahertz, but in Japan, it actually ends at 146. So in theory, if you brought a US radio to Japan, you could operate it illegally in a frequency that's not allowed. So you do have to study these things. And the Japanese Amateur Radio League actually does a fantastic job documenting all this in English. Yeah. So now, with my license in hand, I was like, okay, great. Well, now it's actually time to start planning this thing and getting serious about it. And, of course, I asked my friends in Japan what their thoughts were and what I could do. And they gave some great suggestions. I was kind of worried there wouldn't be enough parks, but then for parks on the air. But when I went on the website, it turns out there's 146 POTA parks in just Tokyo alone. And best of all of them were accessible by public transport. In fact, I think like I think only a quarter of the population in Tokyo even has a car. Like it is just so well connected, and their public infrastructure is so well put together and on time all the time that you can essentially traverse this entire map you see here just by hopping on a train and tapping your tap card, and the world's your oyster. Um, my you know I picked a nearby park to where my friend lived, Yoyogi Park. But I think my main concern at that time was like, where do I set up and how do I set up, right? Like setting up these big HF antennas might attract the wrong attention, and I don't speak the language at all. I also want to be very respectful, and I don't want to be setting up an antenna in some peaceful park where people usually go to have a relaxing time, and instead there's this guy making CW tones and taking up all this space. So like I was very paranoid about that. Um, so that was the POTA aspect of it. And then I figured, okay, well, I got to plan my SOTA summits. And it turns out uh, if you want to do SOTA, you need summits. And Tokyo is very flat. I mean, it is, it looks like Los Angeles effectively. And all the parks, or sorry, all the summits are out in the outskirts in the mountainous regions around the area, which made it a little extra challenging because, like, I could have rented a car, but they drive on the opposite side of the road, and I don't want to figure out how to do that. And it's also expensive, and it was too much scope. So I figured whatever I do, whichever summit I try to go to, it should be accessible by train and by bus. And after some searching, I found Mount Ariyashiyama, which was about an hour and a half train ride from the center of Tokyo. And I'm from LA. Like, this is a commute one way typically for some people. Not for me anymore, thank God. But an hour and a half didn't seem so bad. And from the train station where it would drop me off near the mountain, it was only a 15-minute walk to the trailhead. And I'd also looked up the mountain and found that it had, I guess, 85 activations, which meant people had been there, people had done SOTA there 85 times. It probably means it's okay, and no one's going to bother you for putting up an antenna. And the hike itself was really easy. A couple hundred feet of gain and only 2 miles and change to get up there. Take a quick swig of water here. So now the time came to start packing. I was flying internationally. I had checked luggage. I didn't want to pack too much stuff. So I ended up packing my IC705, which is an all-band radio. And in fact, something I haven't mentioned here yet is that when you obtain your license, you actually have to register what radio you want to use with that license in Japan. So at the time, I ended up selecting the IC705 because it just covered as much of the bands as I would probably ever want to use, more than I would ever need to activate a park or a summit. I didn't have a backup radio. I usually like to bring backup stuff, but it was too much stuff to bring with me. And on top of that, it was not registered as part of my license, and I did not want to mess with any of the paperwork at this point, so close to the trip. So I packed for 10 meter, 15, 20, and 40, and specifically cared about 15 meter because that was the opening, at least in our evening time, their morning to work the US. And this time I had to think about it backwards instead of, I had to think about it as a Japanese person working the US, and had to figure out the times for that. I'm not going to go through this list here, but these were all the things I brought with me. Probably packed more than I really needed to pack. And then hopped on the plane, got to Japan, had a nice giant bowl of ramen, which was a great way to sort of overcome the jet lag, because that immediately knocked me out at night, and I was able to wake up on somewhat Japanese time. And there's so much to share about the country in terms of its beauty and the food and the culture and everything. But these next few slides are all just sort of cool photos I took of ham radio related things I saw. And one city in particular that was really interesting was Akihabara, which is the sort of like electric city. There's all sorts of radio shops and electronics shops and video games, and you name it. If it's technology related and they sell it, it's probably sold in Akihabara. And so here was like their, I think it's called Rocket Ham Radio, which is like the equivalent to their HRO, if you will, or DX Engineering. And all these shops, I mean, there's tons of shops in these buildings just filled to the brim with like little mom and pop shops, usually with one person behind the counter with like, all they do is sell LEDs or all they do is sell connectors. Or, I found one little mini shop that just sold transformers. Like that's it. You name the windings, they'll even build you a transformer. It was like heaven. And you run into wacky things too, right? So like this was a photo I took and I couldn't believe it. Like someone was selling a homebrew 47.1 gigahertz transverter. Like where on earth are you going to find that um, anywhere else? It was super cool. So the time came to go activate the park, and Yoyogi Park was the nearest park to my friend, and I had friends overseas waiting for me. I'd emailed everyone what frequencies I was going to be on to remember that my call sign was different in Japan. Selected all the times, and before I got to the park, I reached out to one of my friends that I had made over Parks on the Air, Mr. Haraguchi, who was like, "Hey, I live in Tokyo. I can meet you at the park." And I'm like, "That sounds fantastic. Let's meet at the park." And so I walk up and I see this guy, hunched over a little tiny tripod with like a wire sticking out or a whip antenna sticking out of it. And it turns out this guy had built his own little homebrew 100 milliwatt radio that hooks up to his phone to do FT8. And he was just sitting there having a blast, just working station after station on FT8. And as you can see, the footprint he was operating in was tiny, right? Like it's the entire rig and the station takes up like 4 square feet at most. Meanwhile, I pull out my fishing pole and string up this like long antenna that goes off up to the fishing pole and then back down. And even as I was setting up, Mr. Haraguchi was like, "Okay, I mean, if you want to set that up, it's kind of weird, but all right." And visitors were stopping by and asking what we're doing. And thankfully, he speaks obviously fluent Japanese and was able to translate and tell them we're doing ham radio. And people were like, "Oh, that's cool, enjoy." And they took off, and I didn't get in trouble or anything like that, which was great. Um, and so, I logged all my contacts. I love using the Hammers app on my iPhone. I even entered my new call sign as a new profile. Took all my contacts and logged them there, and was able to upload it to the POTA system. And the system didn't even flinch that I was using a different call sign. Like it knew that you can operate as a different call sign. So I still got my awards under N6ARA. What was really great though was that the first two QSOs I made were actually my friends here in the US. So Rob K6KM, and I'm sure at least one of you must know Justin K5EM. They were able to work me, and it was just really nice to hear some familiar calls on a band I probably would not, in that time, I probably would not have heard them on. And it was really interesting. It was wild to turn on the radio and sweep around the frequencies and realize that you're somewhere different. Like the air really felt different. And especially in the voice bands, all you're hearing is Japanese and different languages. Like there just was no English whatsoever. And I should say, as soon as I started calling CQ, I was operating CW. The pileup was absolutely nuts. I mean, I was jet lagged, and there was tons of foreign call signs calling me back. I'm not very good with foreign call signs. I'm used to like N6 or W or A or K, and there's like J's and like call signs starting with like numbers, which I wasn't as familiar with. I'm sure you guys do DX and are very familiar with that, but that was very, very foreign to me. And so I struggled to make contacts. It was a fun challenge in that regard. And what blew me away the most though was the 40-meter band. And so if you ever go to Japan, by the way, you can just pack 40-meter. Like it's all you really need. It turns out Japan has twice the number of ham radio operators than that of the US. And they are in the same landmass, roughly the same landmass as California. So 40-meter is just lit up all the time. I mean, this was this picture I took of the band was like in the middle of the day during a work day, and there's just all this activity going on. So I can only imagine what it looks like after hours and on the weekends. And so it was cool. I took a photo with Mr. Haraguchi, and he actually gave me one of his really neat microcontroller based CW paddles that does some like auto keying and stuff like that. And it was a really really kind gift that I've kept with me and use quite a bit now. Also, the person who helped me get my call sign. So I got to go meet up with him. He lives in Nagano, which is a little further out in the Alps of Japan. And so I took the Shinkansen bullet train for about an hour and a half and got to him, and we hiked up. Actually, I don't even remember this summit's name now, but it was beautiful and it was a lot of fun. And it was really cool to meet the person who helped me get my call sign. And it turns out he's a really interesting, really funny guy, really kind dude. And it was wild to meet someone in person that you've only talked to over CW tones. Uh, really enjoyed that. As for hiking and doing summits on the air out there, as I mentioned earlier, when I hiked up Mount Ariyashima, I was a little concerned about what it was going to be like, mostly because in Los Angeles, at least, I know VHF, UHF, I can contact anybody. Cell reception's a bit spotty, but even then, sometimes you can get away with making phone calls. So if you get lost or something happens, um, you can at least get your way out of there. But over there, I didn't know what to expect. So I very much overpacked. I had offline maps and radios and my satellite tracker in case I really, really got lost. And so, that morning I started at 6 a.m. In Tokyo, hopped on the train and got to experience rush hour in Japan, which is an experience, is all I'll say. It was very wild and very crammed and very busy. But by the time the train got out into the outskirts, things had died down. It was very calm, peaceful, beautiful day. And it was really easy to find the trailhead. And it turns out the trail itself was super well maintained. I mean, there were these beautiful signs telling you how far it was to the top. The path itself was very clear. It seems like some people had been maintaining the trail really well. So very much in line with my entire experience in Japan, where like everything is just super clean. I mean, you can't find a piece of trash on the ground out there. And it was just blissful and peaceful and just gorgeous. Um, so I set up like I usually do in the dirt, threw up my NFED half wave. This time I was alone, but nobody was there. I think I was also there on a work day, so even less likely I'd run into someone. Worked a bunch of bands, got overwhelmed by the pileup yet again. I think I made like 32 QSOs in about 20 minutes, and I'm a slow CW operator. I am not a fast guy. Um, and by the time I was done, I was like, I had to QRT. I mean, people were still calling me, but I was just my brain was short circuited by then. And it was cool. You come back to the house and upload your logs and see how you did, and you work your friends in the U.S. and you work a bunch of new call signs in Japan, and you have a good time. So conclusions from all of this and sort of lessons learned. Um, First and foremost, I set out a goal to do this and did it and made it work. And that this is all, I covered all of that and what it took to get to that. One of the key lessons learned though was 40 meter. And I think the next time I go, I'm definitely going to be packing a much smaller radio and probably just working 40 meter because you really don't need more bands than that out there. Um, SSB and voice, I love working sideband as well. I'm not just a pure CW guy, but when I turned the dial around and tried to listen for any English stations, nobody out there spoke English. I mean, it was all in Japanese. And so I kind of it got a little scared of that. I didn't want to start calling, and I'm sure it was just more mic fright than anything. I'm sure someone would have heard me and been kind enough to switch to English, but didn't really try SSB much. But FT8, as always, like if you can't activate CW, if you can't activate SSB, FT8 is a fantastic fallback. You're guaranteed to get the contacts you need to make the activation work. Um, and really, I think the other key takeaways were like start somewhere easy. You don't have to do anything crazy to begin with. I one of my goals next year, or what am I saying next year? It's this year in 2025, is to hopefully hike to go back to Japan and hike up Mount Fuji, and hopefully that is a SOTA summit, and hopefully activate Mount Fuji. So you don't have to start high. You can start low and uh, you know learn the country and how things operate there before you do something wild. Let's see what else. Chasing community made it all possible, of course. Sending emails and getting people primed to listen for me made a huge difference, especially working friends back in the United States. And this is sort of the same slide I had in the Pacific Northwest DX conference, which is like I really believe there's a wild amount of overlap between SOTA and POTA and DXing and DXpeditioners. And really, I think these communities should have more exchanges of people. For people who do contesting or DX, SOTA and POTA is a great way to just crank out contacts and really exercise your field gear. And I think a lot of SOTA and POTA people, in fact, don't really know much about DXing and DXpeditions. And I think, clubs such as yourselves should really encourage folks who are in that aspect of the hobby to come over and check out what's going on in the DX world. Because at the end of the day, everybody's in it for the adventure and for the fun, right? That is the end of the talk. I will take some presentations, but I'll also quickly give a plug for a new YouTube channel that I started under N6ARA Electronics. And I have another SOTA-based YouTube channel with my friend Mark, KD7DTS, called SOTA Plus, which is a lot of fun. And here's my contact info, email, and CW if you want to reach me on weekends. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this.